Hey guys, so I probably will not be shooting the gun this weekend. Sorry to disappoint you. I know a few of you kind of been harassing me about that, want to see me shoot it, but there are a few things I still need to do. First thing I want to do is admit an error that I made. The beaver tail grip safety and the mainspring housing apparently are not titanium. I've been saying they were. I thought they were. Apparently just the frame is titanium. So I was talking about how the sparks were a different color. They seemed more white to me when I was using the bench grinder in the garage. The sparks seemed more white rather than the yellow that I'm used to when I grind steel. So I don't know if it's a slightly different alloy and that would make the sparks a different color, or if that was just my imagination. But anyway, apparently these are carbon steel. And anyway, I will be trying to, I don't know if you remember this void in the beaver tail grip safety there. I'm going to try to silver solder that, so that's a good thing about it being carbon steel. I can at least attempt to repair that myself. I was going to have to pay a professional welder to TIG weld it if it was titanium. So I'm going to give that a shot. Other than that, there's one thing I want to talk about in this video, and that is springs. So let's get into that. So this is the guide rod. It's a GI style guide rod, which I think is probably the same as the original. And this concave part here, you put that against the barrel when you put the gun together, then you slide the slide barrel and guide rod assembly onto the frame. So the rounded part, the convex part of the guide rod, sits right in here. And this edge, this flat edge, fits flush up against this inside part here. And the spring pushes that up flat against there and holds it there. Alright, so the guide rod will be sitting in here, flat against that, and when you fire the gun, the slide is in recoil, it'll come back, spring goes through here over the top of the guide rod, the slide will come back, and this rear surface right here will hit that surface of the guide rod. And that's what stops the rearward movement of the slide. And I did not know that. I thought the spring, the recoil spring, just becoming completely compressed is what stopped that movement. But it's not. The slide moves to the rear in recoil. This surface hits the rear surface of the guide rod, which is resting against and being held against that surface right there by the spring, by the recoil spring. And that stops the rearward movement. And I was going to use a 28-pound spring, but I learned that that's not necessarily ideal, and I was going to use a heavy spring to help absorb all the recoil of the powerful 10mm cartridge. But the problem with that is that that strong spring is going to push the slide back forward into battery with a lot of force. And the slide stop pin comes through here, as you guys know, and as this comes back forward, the barrel rides up on that pin using the lower lugs, and then comes to a stop when the vertical surface of the lower lugs here hits that pin. And that can create a lot of force if you use a really powerful spring, and it can just be hard on these components, the slide stop pin and those lower lugs. So that's not ideal, and I did not even consider that. So there's another thing you can do that'll help take up some of that recoil energy of the 10mm. Before I show you that, let me show you one other thing. And this is the 28-pound spring. And when you put it in the guide plug here, it's kind of there's no space. It's a snug fit. And apparently when these springs compress, they expand in diameter a little bit, And let me show you what was happening. Okay, ignore all this overexposed stuff around the outside. Just look at the guide rod there. Now gravity is pulling it down sort of limply this direction. So it's just jiggling in there. But when the slide moves all the way to the rear, I told you that, and I think I saw it referred to as the spring tunnel. That part right there that's surrounding the guide rod. When the rear of that hits the guide rod, you'll see this guide rod straighten out because it's being clamped between that rear surface and the frame. See that? Alright, so that's when the slide is all the way to the rear. So you can see what's happening. It's getting clamped between the back of the slide, or the spring tunnel of the slide, and the frame. So that guide rod kind of pops up there. And I put a piece of tape on the slide and a piece on the frame so that you can see how they align when the slide is all the way back. So now we know exactly how far back the slide is supposed to move when the gun fires. This is where it stops. And with the 28-pound spring in there, I told you that it's binding in the plug because as it compresses, its diameter increases slightly, and it was already a snug fit. So see if these lines line up. They should, right? Because in recoil, this should come all the way back and touch the guide plug, which is against the frame. Just like I showed you with no spring in the gun. See where they stop? It's about a ½ inch shy. Because that spring is binding in here, and so it's not being allowed to compress completely. On the other hand, and I just put the 24-pound spring in, I don't know if you can hear it, with the 28-pound spring, when it stopped moving, it didn't really make much of a sound because the spring was just kind of bunching up and it would softly stop the slide from moving to the rear. But with the 24-pound spring, it's a little smaller diameter, so it doesn't bunch up in here, and so the slide can move all the way to the rear and stop metal on metal, and you can hear the difference. And you can see those lines line up. So it goes just as far back with the spring as it does with no spring. Alright, so those are some things I learned about springs. Now let me show you the other thing that can help absorb the recoil of the 10mm aside from the recoil spring. And I'm going to use that to my advantage so I can use a slightly less powerful recoil spring and yet still control that heavy recoil from the super awesome 10mm cartridge. Alright, now I have not done a practice drawing, so I'm not sure how this is going to go. Alright, muzzle is that way. So let's say this is the hammer. So a firing pin would be right here. And let's just say we've got a little nub on there. And mainspring pushing up in that direction. Alright, mainspring pushes this way, rotates the hammer around that way, it hits the firing pin there. Alright, so let's say that is the firing pin stop. Alright, now if I've got a squared off firing pin, actually let me start with the other option. This is exaggerated so you get the idea. Alright, so basically this is a lever arm, and when the gun fires, the slide pushes back on this lever arm. This is the hammer, remember? So if you have a typical firing pin stop, it's curved on the back here, and so basically it's pushing at about this point on the lever arm. So we've got a little bit of leverage. With a squared firing pin, it comes down here. This one is way up here. The squared corner is way down low, pushing right about down there. So you've got a much shorter lever arm here. Alright, so this is, with a longer lever arm, it's easier to push back and cock the hammer and work against the mainspring there that's applying a force in this direction. With a squared off firing pin, you're filling in this stuff down here, so you're shortening your lever arm to just this little bit here. So I do have a squared off firing pin stop, and so between that, so you could change how much resistance you get in this part of the gun two ways: by switching between a rounded to varying degrees firing pin stop or a square one. So you could go from square, to just a little bit of a rounded corner to a huge radius, and essentially get a longer and longer lever arm. Number two, you could change the weight of your mainspring. So the more of a round off you've got, the more leverage you've got. So the less it absorbs the recoil from the gun, the easier the slide moves to the rear. Likewise, the lower the weight of the mainspring, same thing, easier just for the slide to move back. So with a heavier recoiling round like a 10mm, if you reduce this radius or go to a square firing pin stop, and the one I have just has a tiny radius, so not much different than squared off, and a heavier firing pin spring, those two things would increase the resistance of the slide to recoil, slowing it down, allowing the recoil or the slide movement to begin later, or preventing it from starting as soon. It's probably a little bit nicer way to put it. So this is what I've already got the squared off firing pin stop. What I'm going to do is play with some heavier mainsprings, and initially I'll probably just use what I have for the test firing, and I'll see how it goes. The squared off firing pin stop may be all I need. If it's throwing brass a quarter mile away or 10 lanes away or whatever, then I'll get a heavy mainspring, or get a few heavier weights and play with those. So I'll use the springs I've got for now, but the reason I'm not going to fire the gun this weekend is because I'm waiting on a new front sight, and I will tell that story in the next video. And I'll show the installation and discuss that a little bit and tell you about the new front sight. But that'll be next video, so probably no shooting the gun this weekend. So stay tuned.